La diffusion vient de démarrer. Tous les participants sont en mode écoute seul.
Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of the NBSAP Forum, the GEF Small Grants Program, the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, Working Group on Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, I welcome you all to our webinar series, which started last Tuesday, titled Indigenous Peoples, Biodiversity Conservation, and Climate Change. Today's third webinar is titled The Challenges and Opportunities in Connecting Community and Conservation. I am Alejandra Pero, the webinar coordinator and facilitator, and I warmly welcome you all to this webinar session. As way of background, the following webinar series provides a learning platform for the GEF Small Grants Fellows and partners to share their experience, work and policy advocacy strategies in community conservation, promotion of biocultural diversity, intercultural communication, the interlinkages between biodiversity conservation and climate change, and the protection of traditional knowledge. The webinar discussions will also offer helpful inputs to the issues addressed at the Nature Culture Summit at this coming CBD talk in November in Egypt. And finally, the discussions this week will also highlight how women's capacity is being strengthened in understanding policy processes related to biodiversity conservation that affect them. Each webinar is led by a GEF Small Grants Program Indigenous Fellow in partnership with a global practitioner and or leader active in the same field. The webinars seek to address a series of questions. The webinars from earlier this week looked at the kinds of communication strategies needed to highlight Indigenous peoples' practices to safeguard the environment vis-a-vis changes to the climate. And another looked into the kinds of indicators that address Indigenous well-being and what action is taking place to position these indicators on the national, local, and global scale. The objective of today's webinar is to look at how local conservation efforts are reaching out to ensure communities can thrive, and in particular, how Indigenous women's rights vis-a-vis climate change policies are being supported in Africa. The webinar will also address global efforts in conservation and how those are becoming more inclusive or not of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. At this time, I'd like to remind you all of certain rules and dynamics in the webinar session. Microphones will be muted during the presentation. This reduces interferences and facilitates the communication. We will have around 35 minutes for presentations, followed by questions and discussion. Please send us your questions or raise your hand in the control panel of the GoToWebinar. If you want to speak and the connection allows it, we will open the microphones, your microphone during the Q&A session. And we would like to remind our speakers of the importance to speak slowly and clearly. This will facilitate everyone's understanding. And we strongly encourage everyone to ask questions. It's a privilege to have our guests with us, so please don't hesitate as we all learn from each other. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for today's session. Minnie Degawan is the current Director of Indigenous and Traditional Peoples Program at Conservation International, based in Arlington, Virginia in the United States. Minnie is a Kankanay Igorot from the Cordillera, Philippines, who has years of experience advocating for greater recognition and respect of Indigenous peoples' rights at the international level. Minnie has worked with Indigenous peoples' organizations from the grassroots, national, regional, and international level on issues ranging from human rights and biodiversity conservation to climate change adaptation and mitigation. Welcome, Minnie, and I welcome the other speakers. I now invite Minnie to please take the floor. Thank you so much.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. It is, I think, a very timely webinar as it discusses very relevant topics. And today I'm really very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers, good friends of mine. Delfin Ganapin is a current governance practice leader of WWF International, where he coordinates the inclusive conservation, anti-corruption, and SDG support initiatives of WWF. Prior to joining WWF, Del has had a very colorful career. First as an activist, and then joining government, and then being in the UN, where he was director of the UNDP GEF Small Grants Program for 14 years. And when he retired, he decided that he still has energy to do work with the NGO sector. So he's now with WWF, based in Singapore. So hi, Del. And
Hi.
And the other speaker is another good friend from long ago, Edna Kaptoyo, a Pokot woman from Kenya. She has been a long-time friend in the International Alliance of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples of the Tropical Forest. This is such a long name, Edna, but we worked together before in the International Alliance, and currently she is very, very much actively engaged in the UN processes, especially related to women and climate change. She is the UNDP GEF Small Grants Program Fellow for Africa. So we will have two very good speakers. So I'll give the floor now to Delfin.
Hello, friends. Thanks for joining our discussion on this very important topic. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation to hopefully help us in the discussion of inclusive conservation, the way forward, and the challenges ahead. In the WWF International, we decided to do a major shift and proceed to what we now call inclusive conservation. The reason for this is that if you take a look at the issues raised by Indigenous peoples and local community stakeholders, it's really about moving away from what we call fortress conservation. Conservation where a great importance is put on plants and animals, but people are not supposed to be in the protected areas in this approach of fortress conservation. So we're looking at it also as a rights and social justice issues, and time has now come to change the way we do things in conservation. In the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues last April, conservation, in fact, was seen as a corrupted terminology, and that fortress conservation is a vestige of colonialism. Also important to note that Indigenous peoples in local communities and a lot of us who are supporters of Indigenous peoples and local communities consider that rights to land, territory, and access to resources are human rights. Another driver to the move to inclusive conservation is our ambition to protect more of the earth. If you take a look at some of our most important group of scientists, the way they aim at conservation, they actually say that we should conserve 50% of the earth. It looks good, but our worry really is that when you try to conserve 50% of the earth, and again you put the importance only to plants and animals and not people, then it could be actually a driver to the displacement of Indigenous peoples in local communities. The aim is good because we need to really protect from unsustainable development. There's going to be an infrastructure tsunami coming. For example, the China's Belt Road Initiative is putting trillions of dollars into creating new roads. And there will be 25 million kilometers of new roads up to 2050. And a lot of them will be in developing countries, in the forested areas of developing countries. And once you set up a road, then you lose that forest. So if we want to really protect the earth, and we have to increase the conservation areas of the earth, where are these areas going to be? From the latest study made by the Center for International Forest Research, as well as the World Conservation Society, it took them about 3 years to do this study. They found out that indigenous lands are crucial for conservation, and that the remaining forests and ecosystems of high biodiversity that we have on Earth covers about 38 million square kilometers. So if we really want to protect the Earth, there's no other way but promote inclusive conservation and allow indigenous peoples and local communities to be the guardians of these conservation areas. So what is inclusive conservation? One way of defining inclusive conservation is to say that we should leave no one behind when we do conservation work. And that there's not just one way of conservation, but many ways, because you have to actually respect the way by which indigenous peoples and local communities do their conservation work within their communities or territories. And that the benefits of conservation must not go to only a small sector of society, just as in the case of, let's say, those people that benefit from water from upland watersheds, but should benefit all. And again, the linking of human rights to conservation. This would involve changing, the regulatory frameworks to bring in more strongly human rights into these frameworks, changing institutions and governance models, developing fair benefit sharing, and really promoting and respecting free prior informed consent, and making sure that our approaches are led by indigenous peoples and local communities, full implementation of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I also take note of the definition of inclusive conservation by the ICCA Consortium, which says that inclusive conservation is where indigenous peoples and local communities are the key actors governing, managing, and conserving their lands, waters, and other gifts of nature. And as necessary and desired, invite others to collaborate with and support them in community-defined terms. So it reverses the way we do conservation. In the past, conservation are top-down, imposed upon indigenous peoples and local communities. And inclusive conservation, it will be the indigenous peoples and local communities that tell us how to do conservation and decides who they want to work with them in doing the conservation work. Now, do we have inclusive conservation examples? I would say yes. As I already mentioned, there's an Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas and Territories Consortium. And their members are those where the community has close relationship with the area. The community holds power and decisions by law and by practice. And the voluntary management by the communities achieves conservation. These areas, the community areas, are very good examples of where inclusive conservation is happening. Now, the challenge we have is how do we scale up the areas under ICCAs? There's a large potential for scaling up. For example, in Indonesia alone, there's about more than 14 million hectares of potential indigenous and community conserved areas that can be delineated, registered, and management and guardianship given to indigenous peoples and local communities. However, if you take a look at what has happened so far, looking at the mapping or the registration of ICCAs into the by the world, by the United Nations Environmental Program, WCMC, you will see that there's only very few of these ICCAs that have been so far registered. In fact, they say that there's only about 11% so far. So where's the 89%? So in the World Wide Fund for Nature, we have decided to create an inclusive conservation initiative called People Protecting Landscapes and Seascapes. And this is, WWF is not the only one getting into inclusive conservation right now, actually. Conservation International is also in inclusive conservation, and MINI actually manages the program there. The GEF has already put inclusive conservation into its program. And so, I think there's a possibility here of bringing all of this work together to create the scaling up. So in this People Protecting Landscapes and Seascapes work that WWF is designing, we are targeting to actually be able to indicatively map at least 25 million hectares by 2020, to be able to advocate at the CBD Cup in Beijing that this is the way to go, that this is the most effective way of conservation, and using that as a foundation to do more work so that by 2030, we have 500 million hectares designated as ICCAs, and create the global systems change because of the massiveness of the success in such designation. The challenge here is that the approach must be indigenous peoples led and local community led, which is somewhat difficult because we have to change the way we do things. For example, for WWF, instead of being the dominant organization, we will be the support organization and taking the lead from the indigenous peoples and local communities that we will work with. Now, is there a foundation for this work? When I look at the WWF itself, we see that there has been actually quite a number of community-based projects where ICCAs were promoted, where people were able to map their community conserved areas and were able to get the management of these conservation areas into their system. But again, the challenge is how to scale up to larger areas than just community areas, and scale it up to landscapes and seascapes. Here is an example of the map of the Salween Peace Park, covering a very large territory of the Karen in Myanmar, which the WWF in Myanmar is helping the indigenous peoples there to map, to delineate, and to get the government to recognize as an ICCA. There are many difficult challenges ahead because if you look at how much of the world areas are really formally recognized by governments, it's only about 18%. And less than 5% of the land is recognized as community controlled and owned. And less than 50% of countries have legal frameworks in place. So a lot of advocacy, creation of new regulation, change in the laws have to be made to be able to do the scaling up. And if you look at, for example, an assessment by Civicus in terms of civic space allowed by governments, allowing communities and civil society to do environmental work, you will see that most of the countries, in fact, these are the countries we've selected to start this inclusive conservation, are actually have closed, repressed, obstructed, or narrowed systems of governance. And there are only very few, mostly, in fact, the developed countries that have an open system. So it's going to be swimming against the current. And my experience is that when you become quite effective in the defense of your territories and of the environment, the powerful groups actually start targeting the leaders of such movements. And in last year, about 197 of environmental defenders were killed defending their lands and territories. So we have to really make sure that when we do the mapping work, when we do this work, it's really for empowerment. It will empower the indigenous peoples and local communities to be able to engage with the local government, national governments, create planning teams, organize wide networks from local to national to global, and have community exchanges so that the network grows from local to national and to global. The good thing is that where before a lot of this mapping and delineation and recognition of rights over lands and territory, it's hard work because you have to carry a big transit and difficult to do the mapping. Now there's this technology available, and in many consultations we have had, it's been decided that a combination of traditional knowledge and modern science and technology could be a way to scale up in a fast way some of the work that has to be done. We can also focus on certain very important aspects of this work, which is really recognizing IP women rights. And in the WWF, we recently included focusing on youth leadership to be part of this work. There are other key actions to meet these challenges. I've already said something about network development, but there's capacity strengthening that has to be made. Within the WWF itself, we decided that there has to be a lot of training in skills development on EPIC, how to do a human rights-based approach, how to really accept an IP-led and local community-led approach. We have to work on policies, and the other important thing to do is come up with innovative financing and benefit schemes so that there is sustainability to the work that will be done. Now, how can success look like? There are actually already some big successes. For example, here you can see that in Colombia, a very big territory of indigenous peoples have been given autonomy. So in a sense, we start with mapping, but eventually what we want is it leads to the autonomy of the indigenous peoples and local communities to the conservation of their lands, territories, and resources. Let me end there and thank you all for listening. And hopefully you will join us in the work ahead. Contact me if there's interest or if you have questions and comments on inclusive conservation as we're trying to do it now. Thanks. And I take back the floor to Marion to continue our program.
Right. Thanks, Delfin, and stay on. There will be a question and answer time after we hear from Edna. So Edna, please unmute yourself.
We can hear you, Edna.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good morning for those who are in Kenya. Can you view me?
We can hear you and we can see your screen.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to speak on Indigenous women and climate change and how I have worked as a GEF SGP fellow for the past years in terms of empowering Indigenous women from Africa region, and especially also focusing on Kenya as well, to realize their rights and also influence policy at the national and local level. And why am I focusing on Indigenous women and climate change? First, most of our Indigenous women live in the most fragile ecosystems, and these are mostly impacted by climate change. So whether they're in the drylands, the lowlands or the plains as well, and some even where they assume the semi-arid, they still face climate change impacts. And these women have seen it for generations. And the important aspect is they are leaders in conserving the environment. And for the past months, we've been collecting data and engaging with women. We've seen they have unique experiences in terms of fighting climate change and also as well as responding to climate change and contributing to the mitigation and adaptation in their communities. Thirdly, a lot of traditional roles placed on Indigenous women make them primary users of natural resources, and also their role as caregivers in the family and the community makes them dependent on resources. So they are at risk by climate change if resources are being depleted, or for instance, if conflicts happen, they're the ones at the forefront, and especially women and children. So climate change as well, interventions presents an entry point, critical one, in terms of addressing issues of land rights, promoting women's equality, which is also part of SDG Goal 5, and also looking at the aspect of their participation in decision making as well, which influences the kind of climate change programming that can be done at local and national or international levels. And of course, women, we know, implement really solutions that are affordable, and I'll share a few as we go towards the presentation further. And they are innovative, and we've had experiences where they've been able to innovate some technologies that have been shared within the community to make it affordable, and also shared it amongst other Indigenous women as well. But we see still there's a challenge in terms of funding access reaching the local level to really scale up these kind of innovations. Also, in terms of decision-making processes and, of course, access to knowledge, there are challenges in terms of women accessing it. And so that's important, as why I decided to focus on climate change, because we have a group of women who are literate or illiterate completely, like 99% cannot read or write, but they're still critical in terms of engaging in these decision-making spaces. And of course, when Indigenous women are involved in decision making and also respond to climate change, they are not only doing it for only themselves, but it does benefit the whole community. And I've seen that in terms of engaging with both men and the local leadership, and they're appreciative of Indigenous women as well, contributing to sustainable solution at the community level. And one example I would like to highlight is the fact that all food production, like nearly 45 to 80%, depending on whether farmers, whether they're pastoralists, all traditional food sources, I mean, the production, preparation, and so forth is dependent upon the women. And so when this climate change impacts these food systems as well, and traditional food systems are faced with climate change related disasters, women are more likely to be impacted more with the children. And one research said at least 14 times likely to suffer losses as well. So women are a critical group to engage in terms of addressing issues of climate change. And so what is being done at the community level in terms of engaging women and also supporting the realization of their rights in climate change policy? First, as well, is engaging the women really to create awareness, to make them understand the issues, and also to get what is their perspective. And the key important thing is the fact that when we started advocacy work, all policymakers kept saying, where is the evidence that women are impacted more? And together with other organizations, we formed partnerships and created working groups on gender nationally, where we work with even with other non-state actors and also state actors to build evidence to inform the policy. And for instance, we targeted the Kenya Meteorological Department and show why when there's disaster, early warning responses measures doesn't reach the community and the women especially. And so they had to package it better in terms of how it can reach different target groups and the timing. And this helped a lot in terms of ensuring that their early warning system was targeted specifically for women as well. So everybody was supported in their initiative. And so this evidence can be able to influence the way policy is informed. So we build evidences to show how women are responding the challenges. And so most of the initiatives that are targeted from the Agriculture Ministry, for instance, are informed from the ground issues rather than top-down initiatives that are usually the case. Secondly, as well, in terms of creating actions to increase women's and girls' participation in climate change policy decision making. For instance, Kenya is devolved governance. So we have the local, the national, and the local government. So policies can be at 2 different levels. And so we support in terms of creating spaces for women to enter into policy making spaces, and especially in enactment and also in the implementation first. And this has ranged from whether it's issues of water, food, and also providing that the space of women as well to lead the discussion. And so when we have women on board, they're able to define the kind of structures and policy decisions that are being put in place. And we also ensure that, for instance, when we have discussions on renewable energy, disaster relief, the women are in space and also represented in those committees, those leadership spaces, because they're able as well to champion Indigenous women's rights there. And one key thing as well is linking the international to local and also local to international advocacy. As you know, when climate change advocacy is done during the international policy space, but as well, we create space to have Indigenous women's voices there and raise awareness of gender and climate change issues, where we partner with many the Women Agenda constituency, even the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and this is in terms of also strengthening Indigenous women's advocacy capacity. So they undergo training at the local level, and they're also able to voice concerns in terms of what are the women's issues coming from the ground, and how does the climate change negotiation influence the local planning as well. And we've had Indigenous women as well organizing for the past 3 years as well, and I've helped co-organize the Indigenous Women's Day, where Indigenous women from all parts of the globe, including Africa, are able to share the different Indigenous women's issues affecting them, and also how they respond to climate change, and also engaging with their policymakers. Also, in terms of policy making as well, there's issue about having the policies being gender responsive. So, of course, we have the Gender Action Plan, which was adopted at the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, and also nationally, what we've been doing, even in other parts, while empowering Indigenous women to understand the gender decisions happening at the climate change policy space, is also to empower them to engage with the national actors who are mandated to implement the Gender Action Plan. And we've had good dialogues with some of our actors, like in Kenya and also in other regions, Uganda, where government are also open to engaging Indigenous people in terms of defining how do we take forward the gender decision in terms of increasing Indigenous women's participation in climate change policy making, and also in implementation of initiative. As well, another component important, and we have partners who've been able to support, is also in terms of access, enhancing access to seed grants for Indigenous women, because when women are able to be supported with resourcing as well and technical support, they're able to scale up and support each other in taking initiative. And lastly, a component that also is important is exchange visits. We've had exchange visits amongst Indigenous women from the region in Africa, and also within Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, where Indigenous women are able to share different technologies and innovation on renewable energy, which is important because once they share, they're able to innovate and support each other. We also had exchange visits among women farmers who are able to exchange ideas on seed preservation and also post-harvest management technologies, for instance, which are important in terms of ensuring food security and so forth. So exchange visit is a bigger component in terms of enhancing the learning and also knowledge sharing amongst the groups. So this next slide, I'm sharing a number of things that Indigenous women are doing. You can see in the far left, you can see women as well engaging in terms of tree planting. So they run tree nurseries as Indigenous women's group, and we've been able to train them, and they've learned through exchanges amongst themselves, where a different group has been able to teach those from the Masa in the Transmara region how to do tree planting, and we've had a number of them engaging in conservation as well. Bottom left, you can see that women also sharing on how they collect and preserve seeds during one of the exchanges. On the top right, we have Indigenous women who are engaging in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change policy advocacy and having a dialogue with other youth and other groups during the last climate change COP23 in Germany. Below, we have Indigenous women from another region where they're having dialogue and conversations on community conservation resilience and the challenges they face, where they're able to map out how they want to take it forward. So we've had a number of initiatives done by Indigenous women or for Indigenous women, and one key component is the fact that one of the issues that came out is that women really have, intimate knowledge in terms of their landscape and how they can adapt and mitigate. An example we have in West Pokot County, we had women that have knowledge in terms of what seeds that they can breed during dry seasons of millet that they can withstand the drought. Second as well, we had there are women from regions like Marsabit who know what kind of livestock and where to migrate to when there's a lot of drought, and past knowledge in terms of pasture management, which are critical for climate change adaptation. And also many Indigenous women also we realized came up with ideas on where are the safe zones when disaster strikes, and they were able to map out and they know the areas where the flooding does not happen and how to get the other people to safety, and also how to really relay the early warning information. So a number of Indigenous women as well in Kenya, for instance, from Mau, they've been able to innovate in terms of providing access to renewable energy and supporting women in terms of using the new technology. They've made briquettes, which they've made from waste matter, and also they reduce pressure from the Mau forest, which is a critical water catchment in area. And this Indigenous women's group are now a community forest user group, and there are more than 24 women groups who came together, and they are now educating and empowering other Indigenous women. So while we empower them on advocacy issues, they're able also to reach out and support the other Indigenous women to learn the new technologies, even for the fuel efficient vehicles. Also, as custodians of biodiversity as well, they've been able to really support in terms of conservation of seeds. And as you know, now we've had challenges in terms of the new seeds that are in the communities. So communities have been able to do seed exchanges and also teach each other in terms of how do we preserve these seeds, how do we collect, and also enhancing the traditional role of Indigenous women in terms of seed collection. So that is all I can share, but in conclusion, I can say if we empower those communities that can see the challenges, in terms of what is happening to the environment, you can be able to realize a lot. And despite the fact that we see these are small scale solutions, they can provide they can be global, so they can provide global solution and adapt and become bigger. And so support is needed in terms of scaling up these solutions, and also using the solutions that women are undertaking at the local level to inform this national and international policy space. And this is what we are keen on advancing more. And Indigenous women are key in terms of mobilizing as well different groups, and this can be it's important in terms of ensuring that we are able to empower a bigger group and continue the knowledge sharing and learning. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Edna. Thank you, Edna. Edna's presentation focused on climate change and women. We all know that climate change is one of the big threats on Indigenous peoples as well as biodiversity. So the need for including women in both climate change and conservation efforts it's basically, I think, no-brainer. It's something that has to be done. So we can now open the floor for questions if there are questions from the participants. Marion can unmute those who want to ask questions.
We have one question from Kara. Actually, I see her hand. Kara, I'm going to open your microphone and you can speak. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Hello.
Great, thank you. Hello, this is Kara Honzak. Thank you. This was a very stimulating conversation. I come from Pathfinder International, and we are a sexual and reproductive health organization that works actively on population health and environment, which is what I work on. And I wanted to ask about, you talked about the importance of large conservation groups changing their business as usual and becoming more responsive to Indigenous peoples who lead the way in asking for support. I worked myself for 10 years at WWF, and I don't feel completely confident that many of the large conservation groups in particular who have the staff and the institutional wherewithal to help support and create a lot of the financial mechanisms, et cetera, that would be needed to support IPs in their pathway towards establishing and getting registered these ICCAs. However, I would imagine that a lot of really creative institutional partnerships would be needed to give a group like WWF the type of capacity it would need to really help empower communities, give them the kinds of tools on what to do in the path forward, because that's not really been WWF's forte, and it's not filled with people that know how to do that in my experience. So what sorts of institutional partnerships do you envision could really give IPs those tools?
Yeah.
Delfin?
Thanks very much, Cara. You know, actually, when I joined WWF, that was also an observation I made. And fortunately, the colleagues were honest enough to say that the skills and in fact, even the values have to be developed further to be able to get into inclusive conservation. That's why we actually already have several workshops just to clarify within the network itself what inclusive conservation is and what are its implications to the way WWF works. And in this inclusive conservation effort, we have approached the ICCA Consortium, the Indigenous and Community Conserved Area Consortium, and they are the ones actually providing us advice on how to proceed with inclusive conservation. We have also asked the People's Forest Program to inform us about how do you do an IP-led and local community-led approach, and how do you do the HRBA approach in doing this work. And they have recently provided us, you know, both criticisms and suggestions, including, in fact, trying to develop very specific red lines with government. The strength of WWF is its relationship with government, but that relationship will now have to be reviewed, and red lines have to be set. You know, one may have to walk out of certain relationships if certain human rights values are violated and the inclusive conservation approach is violated. So it's a difficult shift, but at least it's good that the network decided that the shift must be made, and that it is actually the best way by which conservation can be implemented. It will take some time. In fact, the ICCA Consortium asked how soon we can be ready, and my answer always is that, you know, I've been an activist, and I said that the terminology we have to use for this is that it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be a struggle internally and externally. But the good thing is that there's a decision to shift and go into inclusive conservation.
If I may add to that, as somebody working in Conservation International and an Indigenous person at that, and prior to that working with WWF as well, I fully agree with Delfin. It's going to be a huge struggle. Conservation organizations have a mindset that needs to be switched, and always, we need to switch their thinking and see and show them that Indigenous peoples are not the subjects that we are, that they have been used to, and that there has to be a genuine dialogue between Indigenous peoples and conservation organizations. This is slowly taking shape. I think conservation organizations are, well, CI, for instance, is developing the capacity of Indigenous peoples to be the ones to actually do the conservation in their territories. And as Delfin said, I think one of the biggest strengths of conservation organizations, their strength and their weakness is their relations with governments. How to leverage that relationship with governments, and Indigenous peoples do not relate well with governments, so there is that bridging that needs to be done. And on this point, I just wanted to flag that there will be an expert group meeting under the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2019 on the theme of conservation and the rights of Indigenous peoples, where we hope to have Indigenous peoples and the big conservation organizations sitting down together and really discussing, and perhaps really agreeing on certain terms and even maybe terminologies. I always reflect on the fact that in my community, there is no word for conservation. We may be better off using sustainable development or sustainable resource use than conservation, because conservation is such a tainted word that it evokes all of these negative views on how conservation was done. But that is something that conservation organizations have to confront and have to accept, that they have done a lot of bad things, but this is the time to do good. So looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Are there any other hands? Because I cannot see who is raising their hands.
Yeah, thank you, Cara. So I'm just going to mute you again. And then we have a question from Grazia. I'm going to open your microphone. Hello, Grazia. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody, and especially good morning to Delfin. And this is Grazia Borrini Feierabend. I'm with the ICCA Consortium, and I, well, first would like to congratulate all of you for the organization of the webinar, and in particular the courage, goodwill, and innovative perspectives of people like Delfin, and I'm sure of many others among the people listening now to the webinar and having spent time organizing it. I'd like to make 2 points. One is about an observation just coming from a main workshop with 26 indigenous peoples representing 13 peoples last week in Peru, and something related to the forthcoming COP14, the conference of the party of the Convention on Biological Diversity, about to happen in Egypt in November. So first, the good news about last week. It was a really powerful workshop in which, for one of the most solid times in my long experience, where I've seen indigenous peoples finally fully appropriating, actually I would say reappropriating conservation for themselves. It's no longer a matter of saying, well, yes, maybe I am not sure if we are to be considered ourselves as actors of conservation, because they, in the past at least, they perceived that conservation was the field and the occupation and the concern of someone else. It is incredibly strong now, the feelings of indigenous people representatives, and I'm not talking about small groups or very small extents of land. We're talking about millions of hectares that the indigenous peoples are claiming now to want to govern themselves in order to conserve them, because they are now very clear that conservation is not for someone else, is not for just beautiful animals, it is their survival. And they are ready to put themselves in front of bulldozers, in front of even guns. And as Delfin mentioned, so many of them are actually facing terrible hardships and sometimes even losing their lives. So I think this is a shift. It's not only a shift in terms of the conservation organizations in the world, but in terms of the indigenous peoples themselves. And it's a most welcome one, because the alliance would make both amazing results for conservation and indigenous peoples. My second point is a question, actually, because I see a tremendous opportunity with the COP14 with regard to the recognition of so-called OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, which it's jargon from the Convention on Biological Diversity for ICCAs and other private conservation initiatives. Now, the risk is that if communities and indigenous peoples map their conserved territories and they sort of offer those maps and their knowledge and capacities to their national governments, the national governments will then count those mapped territories as part of the goodies. They show off what they are able to do for conservation to the rest of the world, and they would have a sort of free lunch because they have not truly helped indigenous peoples and local communities to conserve in most of those cases. So what kind of counterpart should they receive from governments? And this, I mean, Delfin knows that we have been initially discussing this as an idea of moving from mapping to governance security. So, you know, what the indigenous peoples and local communities could ask is, as a counterpart for their own conserved territories, they could request better recognition of their governance capacities and the security of that governance in the long term. So my question is to Delfin and other conservation organizations, can we rally around that request? Would that seem interesting for all of you, and as it seemed interesting for indigenous peoples? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Minnie, shall I answer now?
Yes, please, Delfin.
Yeah. Very good observations and good question, Gracia. We've again, within our group in WWF, we've discussed this, and we indeed feel that strengthening the governance aspect, that's why we're trying to make this terminology of empowerment mapping. It's mapping is a tool, you know, but empowerment is the key to this whole thing. And the reason why this advocacy at local, national, and global levels becomes also a key action in all of this. And that's why, you know, in the thinking is that if the OECM provisions is strengthened in CAP 14, hopefully when we get to CAP 15, we can really make the governments ensure that they would recognize the governance mechanisms of indigenous peoples and local communities, rather than end up actually embedding them within existing protected area systems or traditional protected area legislation. So that advocacy, in fact, becomes a prerequisite before moving on to targeting these 500 million hectares or 500 million hectares for ICCAs. Because we have to get, as you said, we have to get the assurance that the governments will not actually use this for their own, self-interest or the interest of the powerful ones that are behind a lot of the governments. And then also for this reason, I think we're looking now at even in the mapping, mapping to be done by indigenous peoples and local communities, not by the big NGOs, and even the database for holding the maps, not to be with the big NGOs. I had a talk myself with Peter of WRI on the landmark initiatives. And I think we feel that what we can do if the indigenous peoples and local communities request it is that we support them to set up their own database so that they own and they manage and they decide who can use their database rather than it be in the big NGOs. So those types of measures has to be thought through, and we can put up some more measures so that in fact the indigenous peoples and local communities become empowered. They own and manage and decide these resources, and we put buffers against governments wanting to boast that they have suddenly increased their conservation areas by just simply putting the ICCAs within the regular protected area systems.
Thanks, Delfin. I'm wondering if Edna would like to respond to that before I respond. Edna?
Yes, Minnie, I think Delfin has raised an important aspect, and thank you for the questions. I think in terms of ensuring conservation is inclusive, issues of inclusion needs to take into account rights, equity, and also respect and valuing indigenous people's conservation practices. And also, I think in terms of, as she says, the mapping is just a tool. And I think at first, that's the important first step in terms of pushing for recognition of indigenous people's self-governance mechanisms that we do have. And also the important aspect is in terms of issues of informed consent, which is also key. And I think to ensure that communities, recognition of communities conservation rather than the mainstream one, we need to really do a lot of support for mapping, and also then go into terms of pushing for better governance structures in the government systems, because in Kenya, for instance, the recognition of community governance is still a problem, even though we have policies and acts in place like the Community Land Rights Act, but still also it needs to go beyond that and ensure the implementation so that you can realize these rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Edna. And I would like to respond not as CI, but as an indigenous person, and to actually strengthen Edna's point, that I think first and foremost that even before recognizing ICCAs or land maps and everything, is the point about recognizing land rights for indigenous peoples. There's no point in having a very good map, whether it is made by indigenous peoples or not, if at the end of the day, government makes a decision that, yes, you have the map, you can have the map, but we still own the land. So I think that's the basic prerequisite, is a recognition of land rights. And two is a recognition that there are existing indigenous conservation systems. And I can point to SASI, which is prevalent in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, where indigenous people set aside a piece of land that is protected for a certain period of time. It's not protected forever. And the same concept in the Pacific Islands, where you have the Rawi. And these are not being recognized. They are being taken as, the whole concept that indigenous knowledge is just anecdotal. It's not scientific. So aside from recognizing land rights, it's also recognizing and respecting the traditional systems that exist within indigenous communities. So I guess there has to be more discussions before we can actually position, because I am, in the many areas that I visited, there are also concerns about mapping itself. It is a tool, both for empowerment and it is a tool for disempowerment. People can lose lands just because of mapping. So there has to be, again, informed consent and empowering the people themselves so that they can make full use of these tools. So yes, there are possibilities about these indigenous-led mapping initiatives, but this has to be done in full consultation and with the full consent of communities. It's not very easy to get that consent because it can also lead to bigger conflicts. So I would actually advise on the side of caution and say that I think there's more to be done in terms of dialogue and discussions about all of these different concepts. So.
Yeah, meaning actually what's happening now is that we're doing an assessment of every country where we will try to see how we can do inclusive conservation. And that assessment includes actually taking a look at risks. Just the risks that you have said that, that actually the mapping can be used for the bad. It could even be, a way by which mining companies and logging companies may actually get better knowledge about the area. So risk assessment was a decision made in Zambia just actually last week when we met there to make sure that we actually develop a strategy country by country, and in fact some even said landscape by landscape. And it has to be driven by indigenous peoples and local communities following EPTIC. And a decision was made that there's no one size fits all approach actually to this work. So that increased the challenge actually ahead of us, but I guess it's the best way to proceed.
Yep. I see that Edna wants to add one more point. Edna, please, before we get another question.
I think also a key component in terms of ensuring support for indigenous people's land rights and also inclusive conservation is supporting of strengthening of these indigenous people's institutions and governance system, because there are existing institutions, but some have been weakened. But to really support these structures is to empower these traditional institutions, the governance systems, and get a lot of stability around it to support the continuation. And I think it's, as Minnie says, it's something that conversation cannot end today, and it needs more dialogue among different actors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Edna.
So we have another question now. Thank you, Grazia, for that. And we have another question from Fabiana. Fabiana, I'm opening your microphone. Can you speak?
Yes, hello. Hi, everybody. Well, I'm from Gran Chaco Foundation from Argentina. We're working in Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia, and the Gran Chaco region. And for one hand, I'd like to share with you that here in Argentina, I'm participating in the advisory group of the ICCA initiative, which is beginning this year or last year recently here. And we began to work with the ICCA consortium, and we are improving and work with indigenous community to participate of this initiative, because the real condition is that many communities, indigenous communities, it's very difficult for them to participate of this kind of initiative. Now, so when I think that think about reinforce, or think about another kind of conservation programs, as Delfin mentioned, is essential to reinforce the local capacity, the indigenous people capacity to manage and to have a permanent dialogue with national and local governments. But for one hand is to share with you this information, because Argentina and the Paraguay and Bolivia too were not participating in this initiative. It's a new opportunity, and we hope that we can improve and work with local and indigenous community to participate in it now, because the focus was in the national parks now, and the indigenous community were not participating in this kind of policy previously, no? So we hope that with this new program we can improve it. For one hand, I'd like to ask and share and know how you work here in Argentina. In some community, many communities have the land property, no? So we for one hand we can ensure the access to land, but not always we can ensure the conservation of this land, no? Because of the poverty, general poverty condition of indigenous people. We know some experiences which articulate conservation processes with the development of traditional activities, now, such as beekeeping, forestry. I mean, in our experience, it's been a very, I don't know if it's really successful, but yes, with good results, to achieve a real conservation of indigenous territories, to reinforce traditional activity, you know, incorporating also technology, because in some occasion, when communities are very poor and they don't have any other incomes, they end up selling wood to the market, no? So how do you see this relationship between conservation and the reinforcement of traditional local activity as a strategy to achieve a real conservation or a more effective conservation?
Thank you, Fabiana. Yes, Delfin.
Yeah, well, we're looking actually at the component that we for now call, benefits, or some would like to call it sustainable livelihoods, or actually perhaps a component that simply recognizes that indigenous peoples and local communities have had actually sustainable livelihoods, or a way of accessing resources within the ecosystems in a sustainable way, and that we should respect and recognize that, and even perhaps strengthen it so that they can deal with issues of poverty and meet the needs of their families. So that becomes, so we're beginning to see components of, well, strengthening governance, then the rights and then the benefits, and creating also nested support mechanisms from the local, national, and global levels. Because as you've said, some local communities have difficulty reaching out to other programs at the national level and particularly at the global level.
Yes.
But indeed, we have to have a comprehensive program. This in fact became a difficulty for us trying to develop this initiative, because some experts say an initiative must be very lean, must be very focused, only one component. But we're beginning to see that we have to have a comprehensive set of components to deal with the challenges ahead. So that's where we are going, where we're incorporating the issue of benefits, sustainable livelihoods into this whole process.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any others?
Thank you, Fabiana. So right now I don't, yeah, another hand raised. Ramit, I'm activating your microphone. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. Hello. I'm Ramit. I'm calling from India. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for this webinar. I joined late. I wanted to join, but there were some instances at home. I have been listening to the last few conversations, and I just had a little thing to contribute, perhaps the experience from India. I don't know whether anybody spoke from India or not. Forgive me if somebody has already spoken from India, but I work with local governments here, and it was India has more than 500,000 rural local governments spread all across the country, and many of them also fall. Many of the local governments are also, run by tribal communities. So there are tribal communities in about 9 states out of around 28 states of India. And those communities, there are separate constitutional provisions which have been made for those communities. So we have a constitutional provision for the local governments. And then later on, after a few years, it was realized that tribal areas and the indigenous communities cannot be governed by the non-tribal Community Act of local government. So there was a separate act which was brought in for them. It was given more powers to the tribal community. Then after a few years, in 2002, there was this Biological Diversity Act which was brought into it, which makes one of the provisions was to form biodiversity management committees at every rural local body level, and that every community and every village will prepare its own people's biodiversity register. So something which Delfin had already mentioned, that it will be the community who will be preparing the database and not anybody else. So that is already there in a legislation, in a law. Then later on, after that, another very important legislation came in 2006, which was known as the Forest Rights Act. It's a detail. It's the name is quite detailed, but the short form is the Forest Rights Act 2006, which was a very, very important act, which the government of India realized, and in the Gazette notification, it mentioned that there have been systemic injustices met out to indigenous communities and forest communities in India, for which, and now there has to be a kind of exercise wherein land needs to be given back to these forest communities. So we have 3 very important acts in India. Of course, the Biological Diversity Act is the most, that act is something which is very less known to the people. Now, what has happened is something very interesting is being seen now since the Local Body Act in tribal areas came in. A couple of villages in many parts of the country, they have declared the village self-rule, and which is probably against the corporate takeover and the state corporate nexus, against mining, against cutting down of forests, because these people have been living traditionally close to the forest, and hence they have now taken on themselves that they have fought battles over years trying to protect their land, but somehow or the other that's been taken away. Their rights have been compromised. There have been atrocities on them, and now they are invoking the constitutional provision, and they have declared self-rule in their village. That is one thing. The other thing is that the point which I wanted to bring up is that there is an entire judicial and a legal system in our country. In a country like India, we have the Supreme Court, we have the High Courts, we have the district courts. But a large section of the legal fraternity is still not very much oriented about these very crucial and critical legislations regarding the interests of the tribals and the indigenous community. So maybe in our international forums, there are 2 aspects. If I have to summarize here, without taking much time, there are 2 aspects. One is there are these 3 strong legislations which does guarantee a lot of rights to indigenous communities and tribals in India to protect their own resources, to have an account of their own resources, to negotiate. The government and the corporate can't take away land or resources without negotiating with these communities and without taking the consent. On the other hand, when these communities actually approach the court of law, if in case there is a violation, they approach the court of law, the court many a times doesn't come out with judgments in favor of them, because a large portion of the legal fraternity is still not very much aware about these things. So there are two very stark aspects here in India, and we have been seeing off late in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a lot of struggles and battles in India, especially in central India states and in the states which have got a huge tribal population, because much of the natural resources are also in those states. And there have been civil society action, and there have been all these various petitions in the court of law which have been languishing. So my point here is, of course, we have to strengthen the governance aspect, as somebody has already mentioned. I think Minnie has mentioned that point. And the governance aspect is something which is being emphasized by these laws. So maybe, in later meetings, the forum can take note of experiences from India, the legislations that have been framed. In fact, I myself had done a comparison of the 3 legislations. I can share it with the larger forum, wherein there have been these critical aspects which have been looked into much detail. So this could be something, a lesson that can be taken from India for the large international thing. Thank you very much for hearing. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ramit. I think that was very informative on the situation of India. Can we have one more question before we have the closing, and also the written questions?
We do have Nancy that is raising her hand. And Nancy, I'm going to open your microphone. I'm just going to ask you maybe to keep it short so we can actually address the remaining written question before concluding. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Delfin, and thank you, Edna, for your presentations. I was just wondering, my name is Nancy Chega, and I'm with the GEF Small Grants Program in Kenya. I was actually wondering about the rate of urbanization, which we know that cities are growing really fast, their boundaries are expanding, and 2 cities that before seemed to be very far from one another are now getting closer and closer. And in between, there could be ICCAs. And I'm just wondering whether you have examples of communities that have somehow managed to sustain their ICCA against the threat of increasing urbanization. But on the other hand, I'm also wondering about the role of youth. Many of them are leaving the countryside, going to urban centers, seemingly not very interested in conservation and in their traditional practices. And, Delfin, you mentioned that in the coming years, you want to be able to delineate about 25 million hectares. But who is going to take care of these ICCAs if many of our youth are leaving the rural areas and going into towns? Thank you.
Minnie, should I answer? Or
Please
Edna first?
I think Delfin and then Edna. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, very good observations, and also a very good suggestion that we should consider the youth. I guess in terms of ICCAs that have been able to actually prevent encroachment by urbanization, we could perhaps ask later on the ICCA consortium if they do have members that have successfully buffered against such encroachment. But let me just note that one of the reasons why we want a scaled up approach and a very fast approach to really delineating and creating as many ICCAs as we can within the shortest period of time is because a lot of this urbanization, a lot of this infrastructure are coming in very fast. They're actually ongoing right now. including agricultural expansion, industrial agricultural expansion. They're going like a tsunami, as we've said. And if we don't do anything within the next 10 years, we're going to lose it. It will be, you know, we will not be able to correct the mistakes made anymore. That's why we have to be fast on this one. And we're looking at the youth because, for example, in Africa, 70% of your population are young. And also, these things take a long-term approach. And, you know, we have to prepare the leaders that will take on the fight, the unfinished work, plus the leaders that will sustain where we have successes. So very important to actually bring in the youth and create the leadership to be able to continue the work. In the Philippines itself, we found out, for example, in a study of the Ifugao rice terraces there, that the reason why the rice terraces are degrading is because the young people do not want to be any more part of the farming systems, the sustainable farming systems there, because they want to, you know, go to the urban areas, things like that. So we recommended that actually strengthening the cultural values of the youth through the school system and through activities in the communities must be one very important aspect of conservation and of really protecting nature.
Okay, Edna, just to remind everybody that we're at the last 6 minutes of the webinar, so we can keep it short. Edna, on the youth and...
Thank you, Nancy, for your questions. I think there are many threats to ICCS, and mostly the bigger part is from external pressures. And of course, population is one of them. We have degradation, and also where institutions or the policies are not working well. And that presents a lot of challenges. And I can give an example, an area where we have a community conserved area in Kenya called Kimintet Nyakweri, which is a forested area and also a wildlife region that's a buffer to the Masai Mara. And the region there, they were able to map out a number of external threats as well as internal. And you're right in terms of mentioning one of the internal one was youth, in terms of having that challenge. Youth are not engaging at the community level. And what was done is to take up the youth and empower them, like build their leadership capacity. And so some youth, when they see value and they're empowered, they're able to take up responsibility and engage in community conservation at the local level. And so it's key, because our biggest population is the youth and they're the future leaders. And if a threat is recognized, I think the key thing is to really look at what are the ways can we empower the youth to really see an opportunity in terms of supporting community conservation, and also what is their perspective. And a key element as well is engaging them in those community dialogues that we have with the elders, the women. We have a bigger component percentage of youth engaging as well and giving their views, and also providing guidance in terms of what do they want to see in community conservation and the kinds of support they need, because they need a lot of support really to engage in community conservation at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you. We are running a bit late, so I'm going to take maybe just one lesson. Actually, Apolinario had his hand on and up, so I'm going to activate your microphone, Apolinario. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you so much.
Perfect. And you can be the last question before we move on to the conclusion. Thank you.
All right, thank you. This is just a very brief one, because I envied most of the ICCAs and the indigenous peoples around the globe that they already are ongoing and giving the switching is under towards inclusive conservation. Negros is still very, very primitive on that aspect, and we are still recognizing the country areas of our indigenous peoples here. What I really wanted to know is what opportunities are there if we want to help these IPs around the island of Negros and within the island itself. We have indigenous people that are asking for help, and with this new streamlining of inclusive conservation, how can we participate and how can we help these communities? Given that GEF is hard to be accessed in the country and only big time NGOs were given the opportunities to submit proposals to them. In fact, what I heard is that they are now concentrating only in the Eastern Philippines. With that, I think we are in a grief of funding support. We are still very primitive as of the moment, particularly on these islands. So can you help me on that aspect?
Okay. Thank you for the question, Delfin. Probably.
I'm sorry, this is a fact.
If this is coming, yes.
The quick answer, Minnie, is that if we can get, Apollinario's address, because we can actually, contact the Small Grants Program in the Philippines, as well as the Foundation for the Philippine Environment in the Philippines, as well as perhaps even the WWF office in the Philippines, and see, how we can help.
Yeah, that was my response, is that both WWF and CI are in the Philippines, but I would like to also suggest that you can also get in touch with the indigenous organizations in the Philippines, and please not to call the people of Negros primitive. I'm sorry. But yes, I would like to give Edna for your closing remarks before we close. Quick closing remarks.
I think despite the discussions that we see, there are many challenges, but as well, I think there are opportunities in terms of scaling up and supporting community in conservation, and also especially like having a special focus on indigenous women, because they have an important role to play, and also to highlight that there's also recognition internationally in terms of the role community conservation is playing. For instance, in the Climate Change Convention, we have the recognition of indigenous people's knowledge and the call for creation of an indigenous people's knowledge platform. So that's a big step, and also having institutions like WWF and the rest that are also GEF and so forth, who are also looking towards empowering indigenous people. And I think partnership is key, and of course we need to push for better recognition at the national level, because that is the biggest challenges we are facing, that communities are not recognized as the best conservation people. So we need to advocate for more support at the local national level. How do we enhance the recognition and also support communities in strengthening their work and also scaling up, because these small scale solutions and also lead to bigger global scale answers in terms of sustainable development challenges we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna. And Delfin?
First, to thank colleagues for your very good suggestions, especially, where we now have to put attention to really strengthening the governance systems, making sure that the governance systems will be supportive of inclusive conservation, of ICCAs, so that whenever we do the mapping and all of this delineation, then it will be to the benefit of indigenous peoples and local communities, that we have to take a look at policies and the complications, that we have to create partnerships and make sure that we're able to link indigenous peoples to the national and global levels of discourse on this. So thanks very much, colleagues. And, hopefully we will end up with an initiative co-designed with indigenous peoples and local communities that will truly get us on the ground with inclusive conservation.
Okay, before I turn it over to Alejandra, I would also like to thank the organizers for this very timely webinar, and also to the participants. Thank you for sparing your time and listening. And just to end, to reiterate the need for continuing dialogue between indigenous peoples and conservation organizations based on mutual respect, and recognizing that indigenous peoples also have needs, and that they shouldn't be made to conserve so that other societies can thrive. So I think that is something very important, and to look at our traditional resource management systems as something that is very viable, not an alternative, but really something that can be strengthened. So thank you all, and I turn it over to Alejandra.
Thank you, Minnie, thank you, Edna, and thank you, Delfin, so much. Just a comment with regard to the questions that are that we have not been able to get to and to respond to. please, we invite you to send them to the NBSAP Forum. There's an area where you can, an interactive place where you can send in the questions. Also, you can send in the questions to me via email, and I am sure that we can then send them to Edna and also to Delfin and to Minnie and also myself, and we can respond to the questions. So you have two channels of communication there that are made available. So again, just thank you so much. This conversation is one that can continue, and there will be many other global spaces such as these that will take place. In fact, I just wanted to also mention that at the COP, the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, there will be a Nature Culture Summit where this conversation will also be continued, and with other speakers in November in Egypt. So for those that will be attending the COP, please sign up to go to the Nature Culture Summit, where we will also be discussing these issues. But anyway, in closing, again, I thank Edna, I thank Delfin, I thank Minnie for your time, for your participation. This is our third session in the webinar series. We will post this webinar recording on the NBSAP Forum YouTube channel, and also there will be a link with the copy along of the presentations. These will also be on the conservationtraining.org course room notice board, and these will all be found on the NBSAP Forum homepage. So please take a look at that for the presentations and for the summaries. Again, thank you very much. And I just would mention that the NBSAP Forum is this global partnership to support the development and the implementation of effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It's hosted by the Secretariat of the CBD, UNDP, and also the UN Environment Program. I hope you've all enjoyed this session. I invite you all to our final session, which is following this one. Our final session will be in Spanish, so for those of you who speak Spanish, and we will be exploring the impact of Latin American Indigenous women's advocacy in international political processes such as the CBD and others that relate to the protection and use of traditional knowledge. I hope you can join us for that session as well. Thank you very much, all of you, for a very engaging conversation, a very engaging morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And I also would like to thank my colleague Marion, who has been wonderful in terms of assisting us with all of the technology that's needed for the GoToWebinar. Thank you all very, very much, and enjoy the rest of your day and evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
friends. Bye-bye.
Thank you.